All we can do is wait as calmly as possible for it to end.
And so part of me, when people are saying Trump is going to open federal land to fossil fuel drilling, thinks, well, what do you think Obama did?
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Today, fears of immigrants and a talk about what could be done to fix the climate solely with regulation. Watch the following minute. It's produced by New Haven Latino immigrants and their friends. Listen carefully to the words. They might be familiar.
I live in a crazy time. Not being able to go outside upsets me more than I can say. And I'm terrified our hiding place will be discovered. All we can do is wait as calmly as possible for it to end. It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and hopes rise within us, only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart.
Yes, all her words were from the diary of Anne Frank. You may want to watch that section again. And the big Cheeto wants to throw all these people out of the country. Brothers and sisters, we need to be in the streets. If you read that outstanding and scary piece in the New York Times about the sinking of parts of Mexico City and the connection to climate change, you'll note it quoted Christian Parenti, who, in talking about climate change, said, "No amount of walls, guns, barbed wire, and armed aerial drones or permanently deployed mercenaries will be able to save one half of the planet from the other." Now, from last November, a portion of Christian Parenti's talk in New Haven when he gave the Mark Schaefer lecture for promoting enduring peace.
Thanks for coming out. And that was a great report back from Standing Rock. That is, what's going on out there is really amazing. So, anyway, yeah, so I was actually born in New Haven. My dad was doing a postdoc here. And so it's always nice to be back to the city of my birth. Since I spoke to an audience for this organization about the book on war and climate change when the book first came out, I think I'm going to probably not say too much about that, but deal first with this question of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, and then the election and questions of what do we do. And the argument in this book, which is edited by Jason Moore and includes a bunch of different essays, is that this idea of the Anthropocene, that human beings are now a force in the geological strata, is actually kind of potentially problematic, and suggests a kind of Malthusian misanthropic sensibility, that people are bad, and that's the key thing that happens. The arrival of human civilization, that's the problem. And actually, that argument does not hold up to historical scrutiny. And a great example of this is actually Native Americans in the Americas. There is a kind of romantic racism that is prevalent left, right, and center about Native Americans treading carefully on the land as stewards of the land, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, Native Americans were very, very robust and aggressive environment makers. And human beings are an environment-making species, as is really every species, right? The atmosphere we have now, the oxygen-rich atmosphere we have, is the result of catastrophic climate change created by methane-breathing bacteria that exhaled oxygen and destroyed their environment. Every organism is actually part of every other organism's environment. And what nature is a series of organism-environment interactions. Beavers need beaver ponds. They don't find them, they make them. And human beings, similarly, are environment-making animals. And one of the primary ways we've done that is with fire. The question at hand is not whether we will make environments or not, but what kind of environment will we make? Will we make an environment that is necrotic in nature, in essence, and reduces biodiversity, or will we make an environment that is conducive to life? So back to how Native Americans operated in the Northeast in particular. They burnt the landscape every year, twice a year, totally transforming it, creating edge habitat, which brought forth lots of life, suppressed certain types of life, suppressed ticks, brought forth the edge habitat that deer needed and other animals that they needed to survive. So there's something to this argument that Jason is making, that the problem is not human beings, the problem is capitalism. It's a more specific iteration of human-environment interaction. It's not simply human-environment interaction the way that the Anthropocene suggests. It's a specific set of social relations that begin, if you really want to push it as far back as possible, 500 years, then really becoming dominant with the Industrial Revolution 250 or so years ago. And when human society becomes driven by the logic of capital accumulation, whereby all economic activity, which is production and consumption, is governed by the cash nexus, governed by the logic of taking money, throwing it into production, not so as to necessarily meet some human need, but to get back more money, right? This is the classic Marxist equation, M prime. Money, throw it into production, you get commodities, you sell those commodities, you get more money, right? That is what Jason is arguing is the problem, and I agree with it. It's not human beings necessarily, because human beings actually have, as in the example of Native Americans in the Northeast here, actually played a very proactive role, but it wasn't negative. It created more life. So, what would happen if there was no fire on Earth would be that the planet would be covered in tall, silent forests, and there would actually be a lot of extinctions that would go with that. But this process of ecological succession is continually interrupted by fire primarily, also by landslides and flooding and hurricanes and other features. But the main thing is fire. And the two main agents of fire are lightning and human beings. So it's only been in really the last 20 years that environmental history has really understood how important, and actually in many ways positive, human beings have been as an environmental force. And it began with studies of Native Americans in the Northeast. It really began, a lot of it, with William Cronin's book, Changes in the Land. I believe he was actually here at Yale when he wrote that. And he was like, he took seriously these kind of scraps of accounts, which were then followed up by scientists who were looking at tree rings, dendrochronology, and saying, oh yeah, well, these accounts of these Dutch explorers saying that the Native Americans are burning the entire landscape twice a year. It sounds kind of crazy. Like, could that really have been the case? And it's like, yeah, actually kind of, that's what the trees show you. And it's like, oh wow. So they were making the landscape. And what they did, essentially, rather than tame animals, was they turned the landscape into a game park. And now people are realizing, scientists are realizing, okay, that actually, this is a crucial part of how savannas are produced in Africa. The first thing was they realized with the elimination of megafauna like elephants, that elephants were culled in the interest of cattle herders in Africa, corporate cattle herders, not pastoralists, but cattle ranchers. And in the name of saving the grasslands, lo and behold, what happens when you remove elephants? The grasslands disappear and you get shrublands come up. And then they realize, oh, wait a minute, these elephants actually produce these grasslands by tamping down the bushes the shrubs, and also redistributing grass seeds and other stuff. But also now they're realizing, okay, and then the role of burning by people was really important. The interaction between both the human beings and the elephants with the landscape is crucial. These grasslands aren't natural, nothing just occurs. Everything is produced by organisms and their environment. So the reason I think that's important is not just because it's interesting and kind of like, you could sound smart at a cocktail party with that, but because it actually speaks to the real potentials of our species. And it also recuperates the positive role we have played in the past. And one of the most dangerous political problems of our moment, I think, is cynicism. And that this story helps liberate us from this cynicism. If you really think that we are bad, if you really think that we are intruders in the garden, then, I mean, what kind of politics is that, And that's an invitation to suicide. And I don't think that's the case. And so we need to, be much more specific, refocus, like, what is it about our species that's problematic? It's these specific social relations that are capitalism, right? That's the problem. It's not something inherent in us, we just do this. Sometimes we do all sorts of stuff. So that's the whole argument around Capitalocene versus Anthropocene. In that vein, the book Tropic of Chaos focuses on the exact opposite type of human-environment interaction. And what I argue is that climate change is exacerbating war and conflict because, or by interacting with two previously existing crises, which are the legacy of Cold War and now post-Cold War, war on terror, militarism, and the legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring. The legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring has attacked the state and reduced the state in much of the developing world to a truncated, corrupt institution that couldn't generally deal with environmental problems even if it wanted to. In the name of market efficiency, in the name of efficiency and economic growth, this ideology holds that the state should be kept out of the way, right? In the famous words of Grover Norquist, the state should be reduced to the size where it can be drowned in a bathtub. Well, when that comes, that's actually the perfect metaphor we should use, right? Like, in the age of freak flooding, is that the kind of state you want? That will drown in a bathtub when it has to stand up to rising sea levels? It's not going to work. So that's what neoliberalism has done. And then Cold War and war on terror militarism has littered the global South with cheap weaponry and primarily men, I use that word intentionally, trained in the arts of asymmetrical warfare, who are responding to the economic crisis and the onset of extreme weather by using the only skills they have, the only tools they have to adapt. Picking up the gun, turning on their neighbors in the name of religion or ethnicity or whatever it is. So these three forces coming together, the extreme weather of climate change, the two pre-existing crises, I call this the catastrophic convergence. That's a form of very negative climate adaptation. That's a form of human-environment interaction that is just the worst possible path forward. And the reason I wrote the book was because that discourse, the recognition of those real problems, was totally dominated by militarists of the right. And you always knew what their punchline was, which was like, more US imperialism, bomb these savages into submission, essentially, so that they'll respect the planet or do this or that or follow the guidance of the United States. Robert Kaplan kind of kicked off this whole sentiment in 1994 with this very arresting and amazing article in The Atlantic, The Coming Anarchy. And he wasn't wrong about the symptoms, he was just completely wrong about the causality. So this was like an attempt to intervene from a sort of social democratic left position to suggest a different set of causality and then a different set of solutions. And so the different solutions are in keeping with this idea of human-environment interaction is not necessarily destructive of life. Potentially, it can solicit or elicit, more biodiversity from the earth, to suggest a different set of methods. And so cutting to the punchline, in terms of climate change, there's definitely a lot we could do. All of this becomes harder to say, or it doesn't become harder to say, it becomes less credible in the face of the Trump administration. But what I have been saying for several years now is that, the good news is that we actually have what we need, not necessarily to totally transform our relationship with biophysical reality and avoid environmental catastrophe, but we have what we need to avoid the worst of climate change and to therefore buy time to then deal with all of the other problems like deforestation, and all of these are, of course, they're discrete problems to the extent that you can sort of impose these abstract distinctions between deforestation and climate change. Where does one begin and the other end? We've got all these other problems of deforestation, soil erosion, overfishing, increased toxicity, et cetera, but if we can avoid self-fueling catastrophic climate change, that could buy time to deal with these other things. How could we do that? Well, the good news is, we actually have, for the moment at least, on the books in this country, the laws we need, which is the Clean Air Act, amended by or modified by a lawsuit and Supreme Court ruling from 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA, which says that the Environmental Protection Agency has to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We spent the entire Obama years, the 8 years, waiting for the administration to issue rules pursuant to that. He issued one rule around automobile emissions, which was easy because automobile emissions were already de facto covered by fuel efficiency standards, which they're not articulated in terms of emissions, but they're de facto emission standards. So that was not that hard to do. And then the second rule was for new coal-fired power plants. That was also politically easy because no one was going to build new coal-fired power plants because of the fracking revolution, unfortunately. Natural gas has become so cheap that it just didn't make sense for anyone to build a gigantic multi-million-dollar power plant and burn coal in it when you can get this much cleaner gas, which is everywhere. And the price of natural gas plummeted by 80%. And natural gas and coal-fired power plants are pretty similar. It's basically, you don't shovel chunks of coal into a coal-fired power plant. It's pulverized into dust, like baby powder mixed with oxygen, blown over a pilot light, and it burns like that. So it's essentially, you can just put natural gas in that nozzle, and the plant is the same. It's just about which fuel goes into it. So that ruling, which said, okay, these are the emissions rules under the Clean Air Act for new coal-fired power plants, and what it meant was that no new coal power plant was going to meet these standards. They couldn't, so they weren't going to be built. But none of them were going to be built. So then there's the Clean Power Plan, and this takes forever and ever. It still hasn't happened. It's been watered down, problematized. So for 8 years we waited for this administration to do something on this front, and really Obama dragged his feet and very effectively covered for the industry. And so part of me, when people are saying Trump is going to open federal land to fossil fuel drilling, thinks, well, what do you think Obama did? I mean, he opened the Arctic, he opened the West Coast, he opened the East Coast to fossil fuel exploration. And there wasn't as much pushback as there is now. I mean, the one good, don't get me wrong, I'm not welcoming Trump at all. But the one good thing is the level of pushback has been impressive, immediately and massively everywhere. So that was the one thing we had. We had these laws, right? We don't actually need to pass new laws. We have these laws. We also have the technology. It's not like we haven't invented electric vehicles or we haven't invented distributed solar power or commercial scale concentrated solar power, wind power. All that stuff exists. It doesn't need to be researched and developed. It needs to be scaled up. We also have the money. The government has enormous amounts of money. Even leaving aside the military budget, which is the obvious place to go to get money, the government at every level, state, local, and federal government, is a large consumer of energy. And if government used its purchasing power to direct money towards clean energy, to buy clean energy, buy electric vehicles. That would do an enormous amount to lower the cost of these technologies. And there are very strict rules around sort of national origin. You think of the United States as a very free market country. It's like our rules about like where the government can actually purchase its paper from are stricter than France or China's, two very statist economies. So, you know, in the name of patriotism, there's rules that say you cannot just buy the cheapest paper. A certain percentage has to come from U.S. sources. So if there were pressure from the environmental movement, you could see that, like, okay, the government has to use its purchasing power to drive these transitions. So there's that money. There's also the crisis of overaccumulation at a global scale. This is the perennial crisis of capitalism, which is that, you know, why are there capitalist bubbles and then economic collapses? It's because capitalism is too successful in accumulating wealth, and then it doesn't have enough profitable outlets to reinvest that. And it fundamentally doesn't have those profitable outlets because it forces under consumption on people by not paying them enough, et cetera, right? So then you get these bubbles and these crashes. The corporate sector is currently sitting on more uninvested cash than at any time since the Federal Reserve has kept these records. It's like up to around $3 trillion. This is money that firms, not that they pay out to stockholders, not that they give to managers as bonuses. This is money that's retained by the firms for investment. It's parked in safe, low-yield government assets, and they're kind of like waiting for what the next big thing is. And of course, they themselves, due to the anarchy of production, can't do that, right? They're all competing against each other, all these firms. They need the state external to the corporate sector to say, okay, this is what's happening. The fossil fuel sector is losing all its value. It's being written off. You know, it's all done. And we need to build out a new energy sector. And you know, if you want to invest in wind farms, if you want to invest in companies that put solar panels on every roof in America, go right ahead. If the policy environment were such to send those cues to the private sector, there is far more than enough money to pour in and fill those things out. So all the pieces we need to deal with the problem are in place. We just haven't had the political will. Now comes this pretty insane political moment, and we have this like very far right Republican Party with a complete renegade at the head of it, Donald Trump, basically set to completely gut the regulatory state. And in terms of what seems to be happening, it's hard to say what's going on, but the nightmare is, and I say this in an article that was just published today on Non-Site, which is a publication that Walter Ben Michaels and Adolph Reed and others put together, but it's called Listening to Trump. That, you know, I think the nightmare is that the Koch-funded elements of the Republican Party, and the Koch brothers and the Koch donor network really have taken over the heart of the Republican Party. Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, is very good on this. Kim Philip Fine's book, Invisible Hands, for a deeper history and for the role of Hayek and the Montpellier Society in setting the kind of groundwork for this. Also, what's his name? Stedman Jones, I forget his first name. Masters of the Universe, British guy. Similar story about the rise of the new right, the role of Hayek, the Austrian economist, who was also a political activist, who in the 1930s writes this essay called Socialism and the Intellectuals, and he laments the rise of the New Deal, and he says, you know, we're being hammered by collectivism, and if we're to regain ground, if the right, or what he calls, you know, liberals, he means like what we would call neoliberals, free marketeers, if we're to regain ground, what we have to do is launch a generation-long war of ideas, and that's what eventually, you know, the right wing does. And the Koch brothers' father is part and parcel of that, and they inherit their money and their ideas from him. He structures their trusts so that they have to spend the first 20 years of income on these charitable operations. They get tax breaks doing it, and that's what funds this whole rise of the far right think tanks and There's like several hundred economics programs that the Kochs and their allied network of donors funded, beginning with George Mason, pushing these just extremely, just detached from history, intellectually unhinged ideological economic ideas into these schools and then into the mainstream. That's the deeper backstory, but long story short, they have, through cultivating intellectuals, through cultivating politicians, I mean, they seem to be kind of in control of the Republican Party. So the nightmare is that Donald Trump, what does Donald Trump believe? It's hard to say. And his Svengali son-in-law, Jared Kushner, whose father was such a Democrat he went to prison for making illegal donations, along with tampering with witnesses and some other things. I forget what the rest of it was. But so the nightmare is that they get together and that Trump really just hands policy over to the far right within the Republican Party, and they just go to town and do everything they can to gut the regulatory state.
You recall last week I talked about a bill in Congress sponsored by Tulsi Gabbard, which I call the Crush the White Helmets Act. On March 5th, there's going to be a protest of Gabbard in Piscataway, New Jersey. See our article on our website for the link to the Facebook page for the protest event. The women who called for and organized that amazingly successful Women's March are stepping it up. And on March 8th, they're calling for a women's strike. Their statement says, "The idea is to mobilize women, including trans women and all who support them, in an international day of struggle, a day of striking, marching, blocking roads, bridges, and squares, abstaining from domestic care and sex work, boycotting, calling out misogynistic politicians and companies, striking in educational institutions." That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.